Thanks, Andrew. Hi, everyone. Yeah, my name's Taimoor. I'm a postdoc at University of New South Wales. And I should just start by having the caveat that I haven't worked in the Southern Ocean for a few years. So some of this will be repetition for those of you who have seen my PhD work, but I promise there is new stuff at the end. But today I'll be looking at various different circulation patterns in the Southern Ocean from a water mass-based lens, and using both models and observations to try and understand how circulation in the Southern Ocean is changing. So we saw this schematic outside as one of the proposed schematics for the review paper as well. But I think it's a really good illustration of all of the different, sometimes competing processes that exist in the Southern Ocean. So we have a strong cooling or buoyancy gradient latitudinally that drives dense water formation in the Southern Ocean, and eventually that leads to Antarctic bottom water that moves northwards. We also have upwelling deep water that drives an upper mechanically driven overturning cell. We have strong westerlies, and all of these different surface forcings and circulation patterns coexist in the Southern Ocean and interact in very complex ways. So I'm going to talk about three different things. This is going to be kind of a quick whip around. I'll skip a lot of details, and I apologize for that, but at least there'll be lots of questions. So first I'll be going from kind of small scale to larger scale. I'll start with open ocean convection, which is a single process in the Southern Ocean that exists that basically fluxes heat vertically, sometimes through the entire water column of the Southern Ocean. Then we'll try and use water mass-based frameworks to understand a broader scale overturning circulation in the Southern Ocean, so the lower and upper overturning cells. And finally, probably the most complex water mass-based framework that I've worked with, which is more basin scale, looking at mixing and surface fluxes in the Southern Ocean inferred purely from observations, so no models involved. Because we're talking about multi-scale dynamics in the Southern Ocean, I thought I'd put up this schematic, which I've adapted from SIO, which kind of shows you the different length and time scales that exist in the global ocean, but also very relevant to the Southern Ocean. We have thermohaline circulation that exists at 10,000 kilometers and thousands of years, all the way down to turbulent convection at fractions of seconds and meters. So typically, and I should say this with a caveat that this isn't always the case, obviously, but global climate models and gridded TS observations exist in this box. This box is probably too tall. Like we probably don't have obs that far, but anyway, we can correct this. But then we also have idealized ocean modeling, where you kind of take that tail, use a sponge to represent it, and then you take this really small scale and use a parameterization potentially to represent it. And then you have something called direct numerical simulation, which basically takes all of those different length scales and squishes them into a fish tank. So you're resolving all of the length scales of interest, but you're doing so by reducing the range of scales between all of those processes. So there is a drawback to DNS, but it's nice because you fully resolve all turbulence in the system. So I'll be actually going through all of these different types of models in this talk if I have time. So we'll start with open ocean convection. This is something that I worked with Bishak Gayan and Andy Hogg while I was at ANU doing my PhD. And I'll just start with a very brief overview about what is open ocean convection. Basically, open ocean convection is the vertical transport of heat and momentum driven by basically often a surface buoyancy forcing, sometimes local circulation patterns and stratification. So initially, we have some preconditioning, which is kind of a doming of isopycnals. It's not very easy to see in this schematic, which is from a DNS model. But we have a weak buoyancy forcing. Perhaps there was a really strong convective event previously, so we have weak stratification, and you get this kind of doming of isopycnals. Once the buoyancy forcing kicks in, so you get this strong cooling patch, you get this really fast transport of heat vertically due to convection. And depending on the local stratification gradient, this can go all the way to the bottom of the ocean. But because you're creating a lateral gradient in buoyancy, you end up pinching off baroclinic eddies. And these eddies basically move out of the convecting patch and actually act to arrest the vertical convection in its path. And so we can actually track these different phases using both direct numerical simulation and MOM6 models. So we take a really simple idealized model. It's periodic in one direction, wall-bounded here, and a northern sponge layer here that kind of restores a linear stratification. And then we just apply a Gaussian patch and see how things are going to change. So the water massy thing about this, which it's a stretch to say that this is a water mass-based framework, but we're tracking the mixed layer and how it grows, which technically is a water mass. And so we do that in direct numerical simulation at different stratifications. And so you see this quasi-linear growth in the mixed layer during deep convection, but depending on the background stratification, you actually end up getting that arrest due to lateral spreading relatively quickly in a weakly stratified ocean, and a little bit more slowly in a strongly stratified ocean. Okay, so that's all cool. But one question that we had when we were doing this study was, in DNS, we're resolving all scales of motion. We're resolving turbulence. How does that compare with these typical KPP, energetic planetary boundary layer parameterizations that exist in a model like MOM6? Well, we were actually able to do the same thing, create kind of an apples to apples comparison with a MOM6 model and look at the mixed layer deepening. It looks kind of similar, but there's one difference, which is that there's this overshoot in the mixed layer depth before it reaches this theoretically determined mixed layer depth based on the lateral spreading. And we think that's because of the way convection is modeled in MOM6, and we propose the development of a stochastic convection parameterization. Yes?
What are the two here?
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, so red is KPP and green is energetic planetary boundary layer scheme. Sorry, yes. Okay, so that open ocean convection drives dense water formation and eventually feeds this overturning circulation. So let's step back a bit, zoom out a little bit, and see if we can use water mass-based frameworks to understand the overturning circulation in the Southern Ocean. So we go back to our direct numerical simulation, which is, again, an idealized turbulence resolving model. And instead of looking at that box, we look at a reentrant channel. So we have flow coming in and going back out. We have a sinusoidal wind stress profile and a tan hyperbolic buoyancy profile. So we're kind of approximating the Southern Ocean and its various forcings as best we can. What we use here is a depth density stream function. So a depth density stream function is essentially what we do is we integrate the vertical velocity in the model at surfaces of constant depth between bins of constant density. The maths is not that important. I'm not going to go through it, but basically it allows us to parse between a buoyancy driven lower cell and a mechanically driven upper cell. And so we use this stream function to try and understand what the overturning circulation looks like in our model, and how it responds to the presence of turbulence, because that's the key thing that we have in DNS that we wouldn't in a regular ocean model. So this is what an example stream function looks like. In the x-axis, we have density. In the y-axis, we have depth. And we get this blue buoyancy-driven cell and this red wind-driven cell. But because our buoyancy forcing is latitudinally changing, we can actually remap the densities, if I can get back to that slide, to a pseudo latitude. And so we basically get an overturning circulation in our direct numerical simulation, which we can look at. So we asked the question, using DNS, what is the impact of resolving turbulent convection on overturning circulation? And so we look at two different cases. We look at one case where the convection is turbulent, and we look at another case where the convection is non-turbulent. So it's kind of more like, you could think of it like a laminar gravity wave or something like that. There's not this kind of stochasticity associated with the vertical transport of heat or momentum. And you can really see that in the presence of turbulence, we have enhanced northward abyssal transport and a strengthening of the lower cell, and the upper cell gets weakened quite a bit in the turbulent case. I should note that this boundary over here is a fixed boundary. It's a no-slip condition, so that's probably affecting how small this upper cell is. So, we have to take these results with a grain of salt. Okay. So we're going to go to the last one, which is what I've been doing currently, which is looking at mixing and surface fluxes in the Southern Ocean. I apologize if this has been a quick whip around, but this is what I'm doing currently. So I'm kind of excited about it, and I wanted to talk about it in a little bit more depth. So when we look at the global temperature salinity distribution, so look at the volume of the ocean in TS space, it looks something like this. We have a lot of volume isolated in like 35 grams per kilogram and 3 degrees Celsius. And then we have these strands of volume that go up. Each of these strands corresponds to a different ocean basin. You have the Southern Ocean, you have the Arctic over here, and you have the surface ocean, which kind of rings around the whole thing. It's kind of an interesting way to look at the ocean because we can track changes to the global TS distribution by looking at this trend over here. But this looks super messy. There's a lot of different bins and a lot of different water masses that are interacting with each other. So if we want to look at changes in TS space, it can be quite difficult to do so. But it is important to look at TS space because it allows us to make insights into how the ocean is changing from just observations of temperature and salinity, which is kind of a neat thing that they allow us to unlock. So instead of looking at this kind of more complicated picture, we can also look at the ocean in temperature and salinity, but at lots of different basins, and then we kind of bin things so that they look, that there's less of them. There's only 128 in each of them, right? And then we can kind of track, okay, how are these water masses moving around in time? And that's going to be something that's quite useful in terms of identifying what the mixing and other profiles look like in the Southern Ocean, which is this box here. This is a global analysis, but I will be talking about the Southern Ocean. So one cool thing about TS space, and this gets me really excited, is that when you mix two water masses, let's say you mix something hot and something cold, it always converges. Mixing is always convergent in TS space, typically. So you always get something warm. You always get something warm from a mixture of something that's cold and something hot. So mixing in TS space always happens along a mixing line, and it is always convergent. That's kind of a cool insight because that means that if we have some water mass at time T0 by these dashed lines, and we know how much heat flux and water flux is being imposed on the ocean, for example, through ERA 5 or other reanalysis products, we literally just need to know the straight line connecting those two water masses to get to this final state, and we can infer this vector, this orange vector over here. So we can infer mixing purely from known surface fluxes and the initial and final state in TS space.
You say like almost always. I mean, mixing it, as I understand it, is like making two things like having the same properties. So
yeah.
How would it not be convergent?
Good question. So there's kind of in steady state or in equilibrium, there is a net rate of mixing that's always occurring. So if we're looking at trends or changes, you can have unmixing. You can have a decrease in the net rate of mixing, but we're not actually going to look at trends here. We're just looking at a state estimate. So I apologize for the confusion. Okay, so hopefully I've done that. Yeah, so based on these different basins, we can do the analysis both globally, but we can also look just at the Southern Ocean, for example, right? So let's go back to these water masses. And let's say this is what it looks like at some time T1, and we have some other time T2, which I haven't shown. But we can just do that analysis. We apply ERA 5, and we look at what the mixing looks like. It's as simple as that. And this is, so we can do that with models. Here I've done it with Access OM2, and these are very preliminary results. I'm not really 100% confident in them, but we can see the freshwater flux due to mixing and heat flux due to mixing in the Southern Ocean. From Access OM2, this is the 1 degree model that was submitted to the CMIP6 consortium, and this is the pre-industrial control. So this is kind of like a state estimate you could think of. And so the orange vectors here I've just remapped, and the blue and red vectors are these guys over here. So there's a lot of complexity that, yes. This is over 500 years that the pre-industrial control is run over. So if you take an end to end, you should get something close to a state estimate because it's just a pre-industrial control line.
And is it very
Yeah, this one is vertically averaged. Yeah. Yes, Maurice.
I get confused, sorry.
That's okay.
OM2 or yes?
This is OM2.
Just for CPU.
So well, I'm not sure how the model is set up, but they have, oh, sorry, this is access CM2. I apologize. Yes, CM2. Yeah. It's the coupled model. Sorry, I missed the C and the O there. Yes, so this is the coupled model, the climate model that I'm using here. We can also, and I'm not going to go into the details of how I calculated this, but we can also get section transports from this method. And so we can see what the overturning looks like in access CM2 in temperature space. And if you're interested in the Southern Ocean, you can just look at this row over here, which is the section between the Southern Ocean over here and the Pacific, Indian, and Atlantic sectors. And you get something that looks reasonably realistic, which is kind of cool. There's very few constraints on this method. The only constraint we have is that mixing must occur along the line. So the fact that we get something that looks like an overturning is a win to me. This is not publishable though, because I haven't done any validation yet with the actual access CM2 overturning stream functions or the actual mixing tendencies that exist that we have available for access CM2. But the cool thing is that we can do it on obs, just pure observations. So we take EN4, which is just a TS hydrography, and we take ERA5, which is an atmospheric reanalysis product. We apply the vectors from ERA5, so the red and blue, and then we get some orange value. And so we can actually, it looks pretty faint on the screen, but we can actually get the impact of mixing on heat fluxes and freshwater fluxes in using purely observations plus reanalysis products. And this kind of relationship here is quite powerful and broadly applicable to any kind of data set where you kind of are trying to conserve the volumes as they move around from time 1 to time 2. We can get an overturning as well, which looks somewhat realistic, but then when you compare it to like a rapid array, it's that double. But it's still cool that it's giving us something. We just need to add more constraints to make it look a bit more realistic, I think. Yeah, and that's it for that section. So basically, the point of this talk was to just demonstrate the way different water mass-based analyses can reveal Southern Ocean dynamics and processes. So we started by tracking the mixed layer to outline the impact of convection, turbulent convection. We looked at depth density stream functions to see what the overturning looks like in turbulence. And finally, we used the somewhat complicated dynamics of changes in TS space to enable quantification of mixing in the Southern Ocean, as well as the overturning circulation. And obviously, this is just scratching the surface of what we can do, but these kinds of tools are really broadly applicable. And I would love to chat with people about how we can apply them to their data sets and their problems. Thank you.